Hi students, you are welcome in this video tutorial. Students, in this video tutorial I am going to introduce you a British poet called Stevie Smith. Let me explain what we are going to learn in this video. First I will tell you the background of Stevie Smith, then we will discuss about the themes on which she wrote or composed her works, or what are the basic themes in her work, and then I will tell you which kind of work she composed, or there is a list of her works, and then I will explain a poem to you. First I will read this poem and then explain the meaning of this poem. So friends, let's start the video. First let's know about Stevie Smith. The actual name of Stevie Smith is Florance Margaret Smith. She was born in England and raised there and died in the London. Her lifespan is 1902 to 1971. Friends, when we look at the life of Stevie Smith, we find that according to her, her father abandoned her family when she was 3 years old, and again at the age of 3 she had to move to her aunt in North London, and her mother, her sister and she had to live with her aunt, and there her aunt raised her, or she grew there in North London. At the age of 5 she has to face a very grave disease called tuberculosis, and in that disease she spent 3 years in secluded. She was very nervous at that time, but she survived from that disease and came out of that disease, and she again freshly started her life. At the age of 16, again she has to face a trauma in her life, that her mother died, and again she became nervous, and again the feeling of loneliness grew in her mind. But again she faced the life very strongly and survived from that trauma also, and then many of the experiences she composed in her poetry. She composed novels, essays, short stories and other kind of things like reviews. She also wrote in the newspaper, but she is basically known as the poet because she is famous as a poet and composed so many volumes of poetry. There are many poems which are recited still today. We find that she imbibed or included the experiences of her life in the poetry or in her poems. Basically she lived in the family of women and she took many experiences from that family. Let me read an experience from her childhood which is occurred in her poem called A House of Mercy. So here are a few lines. It was a house of female habitation. 2 ladies fair inhabited the house, and they were brave, for although fear knocked loud upon the door and said he must come in, they did not let him in. Now dear students, if you look at these lines are very clearly states that how the life of women are affected by fear, and sometimes fear knocked on the door of these women or at the house of these women, but these women were brave. Actually she is describing the very experiences of her life. She encountered this kind of fear, she faced this kind of death in her life, and the same kind of things she is trying to give in her poem called The House of Mercy. So friend, these are some of the experiences she is combining in her poetry. Now when we again look at her life, we find that most of the time she preferred to live in loneliness, or she lived the life of alone. But again when she is asked, she says that she was a social animal and she had the bond with many creative writers. Actually she was socialized with many creative writers, and let me tell you an example that Sylvia Plath was the fan of her poetry, and Sylvia Plath sent her a letter and described herself to Smith. That Sylvia Plath says about herself in a letter she sent in 1962 that she is Smith addict, means she is now reading poetry of Stevie Smith and she is greatly influenced by the poems of Stevie Smith, and hence she calls herself as the Stevie Smith addict. So Sylvia Plath was a fan of her poetry and she wanted to meet her in person, but when she sent her a letter in 1962, after some days she committed suicide. As we all know that Sylvia Plath committed suicide, and the meeting remained in the hollow. So this was the social kind of things in her life or in the life of Stevie Smith. There was a play based on the life of Stevie Smith, and in that play the whole life is described. The name of that play is Stevie, and the same play has been adopted in the film which has become very famous called Stevie, and the film came in 1978 and it was a very successful film. So this is the brief life story of Stevie Smith. Actually, when you look at the life story of Stevie Smith, you find that how an author is made and how Stevie Smith has wrote on her own experiences. So these all things we understand when we look at the life of Stevie Smith. Now friends, let me tell you that what kind of themes she composed on in her works. She wrote on loneliness, she wrote on war, she wrote on middle class British life. Again, some of the themes we find religion is there in her works. She talks about atheism, she talks about post-World War world and the effects of war and how life is affected by this war. Many kinds of things are there in the poetry or in the works of Stevie Smith. Now friends, let's move to the next part, that is her major works. Actually, she wrote novels, essays, short stories, reviews, but here I will tell you or list her major poetry collections and novels, and there are some other works. First, novels. The very first novel she composed is Novel on Yellow Paper, published in 1936. In this novel she talks about her life experiences, or generally we find that this novel is based on her own life. If you read this novel, you will understand it. The second novel she wrote is Over the Frontier, published in 1938, and she wanted to give a very bleak kind of message through this novel. Let me read this message, then you will understand what is this message. Power and cruelty are the strengths of our lives, and only in their weakness is their love. Now when we look at this statement, we find that what she wanted to convey us, she says that power and cruelty is the strengths of lives. Now there is something complex in the mind of this author or this poet, and the same thing she wanted to convey to us. Because how it can be the strength of life, cruelty how can be the strength of life? This is a simple question, but there must be some complex kind of things happened in the life of this poet, and so that she conveys this kind of message to us. And she says that the weakness of this power and cruelty leads you to the love. So this is the message. Actually, when you read this second novel, Over the Frontiers, you will understand why she is saying this kind of things, because there are so many relations she explains, actually the complex relations in the novel, and many relations failed. So because of that, we can say that this kind of philosophy she might have developed in her mind. The third novel here we have The Holiday, published in 1949. Actually, this is a favorite novel of Stevie Smith, and in this novel she talks about her personal and political issues, and she also talks about the post-war world, how the world is affected by war and what are the devastating effects of this war. Many things she has imbibed in this third novel called The Holiday. And she also talks about the failed relationships and how these relationships are difficult to maintain in life is the theme of this novel. So many things she wanted to convey in this novel. So these are her three novels which she composed. Now friends, let's move to the significant part of her works, that is she is a poet, and she composed I think 10 to 12 collections of poetry and many poems, and then she became famous. She read her poems on BBC. So let's list the major poetry collections of Stevie Smith. The very first poetry collection we have, A Good Time was had by all 1937, 2 tender only to one 1938, number 3 mother what is man 1942, 4 alone in the woods 1947, 5 Herald's Leap 1950, 6 Not Waving but Drowning 1957, 7 Selected Poems 1962, number 8 The Frog Prince 1966, number 9 The West Beast 1969, 10 Two in One 1971, 11 Scorpion and Other Poems 1972, it is published after her death, 12 Collected Poems 1975. Friends, these are some of his poetry collections which became famous and they made her a famous poet. If you look at the titles of these collections, you find how these titles are telling us different kinds of stories. For example, Alone in the Woods. Now this title is very clearly states that how she felt the experiences of loneliness in her life, and that's why she is taking the title or giving the title to her poetry collection Alone in the Woods. So we can guess what is there in the poetry collection called Alone in the Woods. So there might be experiences, or there must be the experiences of her life. Some of other works here we have. Some Are More Human Than Others, a sketchbook 1958, Cats in Color 1959, Me Again, Uncollected Writings of Stevie Smith 1984, published after her death, The Necessity of Not Believing 1958. So friends, these are some of the notable works composed by Stevie Smith. Now there is a most famous poem of Stevie Smith called Not Waving but Drowning, and I will read this poem and explain you the meaning of this poem. So this is a very famous poem, and many times this is quoted poem, and every line, if you concentrate, you find that how she is asking many things to the society and how she wanted to share her experiences to the society. Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving but drowning. Poor chap, he always loved laughing, and now he is dead. It must have been too cold for him, his heart gave way. They said, oh no, 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 it was too cold always. Still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving but drowning. Friends, this is a narrative poem, and in this poem she is just describing a dead man and the life of that dead man, and there are many themes included in this poem. For example, she is talking about loneliness, she is talking about the misunderstandings in the society. We consider this poem as a criticism of the society, because most of the time when you ask someone for help, you do not get that help. And in the same way, there is a man in this narrative poem, he is drowning in the water, and people are misunderstanding him that he is just waving his hand to the people, but this is not the condition. And most of the times these kind of things happen in the society, and society neglects the people in the society. So the same kind of things might have been happened with Stevie Smith, and she also have been neglected in her life by the society, and the same experience just she is sharing with us through this poem. So friends, this is all about the Stevie Smith, her background, her major works, her poetry collections, and most famous poem called Not Waving but Drowning. And if you have any other idea regarding Stevie Smith, or if you have any other information, you can share this information to me through the comments. I will definitely appreciate your comments. So thank you very much for watching the complete tutorial. Please like this video, share this video among your friends, subscribe to Literature Simply, and don't forget to press the bell notification icon for updates.